People think the smallest objects can't hold any real truth, but sometimes a single scrap of paper can rearrange a life. When I found the note balanced against the kitchen candle, the wax still warm, I knew she hadn't meant for me to discover it so quickly. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have even guessed, was that my brother Dut had been waiting for this moment long before I ever saw the words. The story begins in a quiet suburban home just outside a small Polish town, where the days move slowly and nothing ever seems urgent until it is. The narrator, a soft-spoken man who works with his hands and avoids conflict, wakes to an unusually still morning. His wife, Mara, has been pulling away in ways he can feel but can't explain, and his older brother, Adrian, has been stopping by more often than usual, offering help, advice, excuses. Everything seems normal on the surface, but the silence in the house has a weight to it, as if the walls themselves know something he doesn't. The house woke before I did, not with noise, but with a kind of waiting, a hush that settled along the walls and drifted under the doorframes, like it knew something I didn't. When I stepped into the hallway, the air felt heavier than morning should be, and by the time I reached the kitchen, I could already smell the truth. That soft, unmistakable scent of a candle that had been blown out only moments ago. It clung to the air like a secret still warm from someone's breath. The light outside hadn't made up its mind yet. Dawn was still just an idea, brushing the clouds with a shy blue-gray glow. Yeah, it was the kind of morning where you expect to hear birds, or the kettle, or a voice from another room. But the house gave me none of that. The kitchen was quiet, too quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you slow your steps without knowing why. Again, I kept thinking Mara might be standing behind the counter, half awake, rubbing her eyes the way she did on cold mornings. But she wasn't there. Instead, the first thing I saw was a candle in the center of the table. A simple off-white pillar candle she always lit when she needed a moment to herself. Its wax had softened along one edge, just enough to say someone was here before me. And leaning against its warm side was a folded note. My name was on the front, written in Mara's looping, unhurried handwriting. The kind she used for birthday cards or grocery lists. She knew I wouldn't read carefully, but seeing it there in the half-light felt wrong, like it wasn't meant to be read with the morning still cold on my skin. I stood by the table a long time, listening to the quiet like it might explain something. My hand hovered above the note, but I didn't touch it, not yet. Somewhere in the back of my mind, a small thought pressed itself forward, that opening it would be like pulling a thread, one that couldn't be woven back once it was gone. Again, I finally sat down the chair, letting out a soft creak that made the room feel smaller. The candle's wick was still dark with smoke, curled like a question mark. I kept staring at it as if watching it long enough might trace back the moment it was last lit. And by whom, I rubbed my thumb against the edge of the note. The paper was still warm. And that detail sat in my chest heavier than it should have, Mara. I said it quietly. I'd call. Just asking the room, but nothing answered back. I unfolded the note slowly, careful like it might crumble if I rushed. The handwriting inside was hers, neat, almost steady, but the words didn't feel like hers, short, quiet in a way she never was with me. Just one small message, no greeting, no explanation. Just a calm sentence sitting alone on the page. I read it once, then again. The room seemed to lean in with me, waiting for a feeling to arrive. Anger, confusion, understanding, but nothing came. And just a thin ribbon of cold settling at the base of my neck. Her handwriting was perfect, familiar. But the tone felt borrowed, like someone speaking through her, not as her. I looked around the kitchen again, searching for something out of place, a dish left out. A coat missing from its hook, but everything was still and untouched, as if she had moved through the house without interrupting a single thing. I read the note a third time. My eyes kept drifting to the loops in her letters, the soft curve in the M of my name, the slight tilt in the A. Little details only someone living beside her day after day would ever notice. And yet, something inside me recoiled. Like I was staring at a signature someone had practiced too many times. I held the paper closer to the candlelight. The flame had been blown out, but the wax still captured the warmth like a memory. Fork and tack, My fingers brushed over the ink. The strokes were clean, but the feeling was wrong. There was no indentation where she usually pressed harder on certain letters. No tiny smudge where her thumb tended to brush the side as she wrote. It was her handwriting, but it wasn't her. A quiet pulse began in my chest, slow and spreading, not panic, not fear. Just a deep, unsettling awareness that I was looking at something familiar wearing a strange face. I leaned back in the chair, the wood groaning softly under my weight. The house remained still, offering neither comfort nor clarity, only that lingering scent of extinguished flame, an echo of someone leaving in the dark. I tried to picture her sitting at the table, writing these words with the candle flickering beside her. But the image wouldn't form. Every version felt forced and clinger. Something inside me whispered that she didn't write this for me. Not really, maybe not even for anyone. But for the moment, for the urgency, for the person who might find it first, who maybe was never meant to be me. I folded the note again, careful, almost reverent. As if mishandling it might erase the only clue I had left in the quiet kitchen. The blue-gray light finally shifted, warming just enough to draw faint lines across the table. They stretched toward the candle like they wanted to touch the cooled wax. I placed the note beside it and let my hand rest there for a moment. The surface felt colder than before. Outside, the first birdsong cut through the silence, thin and distant, a normal morning trying to begin. But something in me knew the day had already changed shape. I stared at the folded note one last time. At my name written in the handwriting I knew better than my own. And the question rose again, quiet but sharp. Why did it feel like Mara didn't write it for me? And who did she mean to find it? The morning light felt unfinished, like it had been poured into the house before it was ready to wake up. Soft, pale, almost hesitant. I stood in the doorway of our living room, the floor cold under my feet, and let my eyes adjust. Something felt missing, not a sound or an object, but a presence, a warmth the walls used to hold without thinking. And as I stepped deeper into the room, the truth settled over me with the gentleness of dust. Gamera had moved through the house recently, but she hadn't moved back. The living room still held the faint chill of night. Our window was cracked open, her habit not mine, just enough to let in a thread of cold morning air. The curtains swayed lightly, brushing against each other like they were whispering secrets too soft for me to catch. I moved slowly, like sudden movement might disturb something fragile. On the coffee table sat her mug, still bearing the faint outline of her lipstick on the rim. It had dried in place, untouched for hours, maybe longer. When I lifted it, the ceramic felt colder than the room. Her scarf was draped across the back of the armchair, left exactly where she tossed it the night before. The fabric held the shape of its last fold, as if waiting for her shoulders to return. I ran my fingers along it, the threads soft and worn from winters she always said were too long, too loud. In the bedroom, the sweater she slept in sometimes, when she got cold or sad, was folded neatly at the foot of the bed. Too neatly, Mara never folded it that way. She always left it in a lazy bundle, half fallen off the corner. Nothing in the room was out of place, but nothing felt lived in either. The air had the stillness of a photograph, a moment captured after someone had stepped away. And I kept telling myself she must have left early, maybe a walk. Maybe she needed fresh air or space or whatever she hadn't said out loud the night before. But even as I tried to believe it, a quiet unease pressed against my ribs. If she'd left, why did the house feel like she didn't expect to come back? I found myself walking in circles, living room to kitchen, kitchen to bedroom, bedroom back to the hall, as though repeating the path might reveal something I missed the first time. The floorboards made small noises beneath me, not loud, just creaks that seemed to echo more than usual, like the house was emptier than it should be. I ended up back in the kitchen without remembering how I got there. The candle still sat in the center of the table, wick dark, wax slightly sunken. It hadn't changed. But I unfolded the note again. The paper felt thinner now, like it had aged in the hour since I first touched it. I stared at Mara's handwriting, her soft loops, her careful spacing. My eyes traced the sentence she left behind, trying to hear her voice inside the words. But all I heard was the quiet. I reread it once more. Something tugged at me. A faint detail I hadn't noticed before. I held the paper closer to the window, letting the gray morning light stretch over it. That's when I saw it. A small indentation under one word, barely there, but unmistakable, a deeper press of the pen, of the kind someone makes when they hesitate, or when their hand shakes, or when they're trying not to write something else entirely. My thumb passed over the spot again. The groove felt deeper than the ink itself, as though whatever she felt writing that word left its own mark. I sat down at the table, the chair making that familiar small click against the tile. But even the sound felt strange, like it didn't belong in the moment, and the indentation tugged at me more than the words did. It didn't fit the calm, careful tone of the rest of the note. It didn't fit Mara. Not the Mara I knew, not the way she wrote when she was certain of something. And she pressed the pen too hard, too deliberately, almost like she stopped mid-thought, and forced herself to choose a different one. I traced the indentation again slower this time, trying to imagine her hand hovering above the candlelight, struggling with whatever she had almost written, whatever she had almost said to me. The house felt even quieter now, like it was leaning closer, listening with me. Every corner, every surface, every shadow felt aware. I stood and walked back to the living room, carrying the note with me, her mug, her scarf, her sweater. Each item felt heavier now, like they were clues instead of memories. Kang. I pressed my forehead against the wall for a moment, breathing in the faint scent of her shampoo that still lingered in the air. Kakanets. It hit me then, not all at once, but like a slow tide. This wasn't early morning quiet. This wasn't the kind of silence that follows sleep. This was the absence of someone who left without leaving a trail, someone who stepped out of a life without taking anything but the truth with them. And that single indentation in the note felt like the only place she let the truth slip through. I returned to the kitchen and laid the note beside the candle again. The light outside was shifting, warming into something more ordinary, but it didn't touch anything inside me. The indentation stared up from the paper, small but sharp, the only raised voice in a quiet room. Kapanake. I let my fingers rest on it the way you hold a pulse to make sure something's alive. The house didn't answer, it just held the silence a little tighter. And standing there in the half-warmed kitchen, one question settled into me like a weight I couldn't set down. Why would she press the pen so hard? On that one word, the first ring sounded too loud for the quiet house, sharp, sudden, almost out of place in the soft morning stillness. I held the phone against my ear, forcing myself to breathe slowly, the way you do when you're afraid of hearing the truth. But the call didn't last long. One ring, then silence, as if someone had cut the line with a pair of scissors. I stared at the phone screen glowing in my hand. Her name was still there, and close enough to touch, far enough to feel like a rumor. The house didn't change while the call failed. It just sank back into its unnatural quiet, a quiet I kept mistaking for calm. I walked to the window, pulling the curtain aside with 2 fingers. Outside, the sky was pale and washed out in a color that didn't belong to any real morning, I knew. The street was empty, the neighbor's yard still damp with dew. I tried calling again, one ring, drop. Like the phone was breathing once before giving up. My thumb hesitated before dialing again. A 4th attempt felt foolish, but the stillness pressing at my ribs made me need to hear something. A hello, a sigh, even the sound of her car door closing in the distance. But the 5th time was the same as the first. A single ring, then the abrupt, unnatural click of a call that never belonged to me. And I set the phone on the kitchen counter. It made a small sound, Roan that echoed too long in the empty space. I leaned both hands against the sink, Katami fingers cold against the steel, cocained in the wand for Kang. The house wasn't just quiet, it felt paused, as if everything inside it waited for me to understand something I wasn't ready to see. I picked up the phone again, not to call, but to listen. Her last message was weeks old. Canis, a simple be home soon, with a heart at the end. I opened our old conversations, scrolling slowly, not letting my thumb move like I was turning fragile pages. There were good mornings, reminders about groceries, small arguments that looked harmless written out like that, no warnings, no hints. Nothing loud enough to echo into this morning. I paused at one thread, a late-night exchange from 2 weeks ago. And she'd asked if I'd be home the next morning. I told her yes, of course. She sent back a single word, okay. I'd been half asleep then, so I hadn't thought anything of it, but reading it now, the word felt heavier. Like she had been measuring something, weighing a decision I never saw her carry. My phone buzzed suddenly, a burst of vibration that startled me enough to tighten my grip. Just a calendar reminder. Nothing important, nothing connected to her. A dog barked outside, deep and sudden. It came from the house 2 doors down, the same dog that barked at mailmen, bicycles, and shadows that moved the wrong way. I walked to the front door and opened it just enough to listen. The air outside was cold too, still for the hour. The dog barked again, then went quiet. I stepped out onto the porch, Kanote barefoot on the wood that still held the night's chill. I wondered then, not for the first time, did anyone see her leave? Did the dog bark when she stepped out? Would someone have noticed the way she walked? If she looked over her shoulder, if she carried anything at all? The driveway stretched out in front of me, dark from the shade of the house. For a moment, I found myself studying it like a photograph, searching for small disturbances. Something shifted or moved. I walked down slowly, feeling pebbles press under my feet, feeling the morning air settle around me like damp cloth. Her car sat exactly where it always sat, same angle, same faint reflection in the window. Same tiny dent in the bumper from a grocery cart months ago. I stared at the driver's door. The handle looked untouched, no smudges, no dew broken by fingertips, no sign of anyone leaving in a hurry. I crouched beside the front tire, running my finger along the dirt around it. The ground held no fresh markings. No new tracks, no signs of movement. I stood there too long, the stillness deepening with every breath. If she didn't use the car, if she didn't walk past the dog, if she didn't call a taxi or leave a trail, then how did she leave? And a gust of wind pushed a dry leaf across the driveway, its soft scrape sounding louder than it should. My hand tightened around the phone still in my pocket. The unanswered calls felt heavier now, more deliberate. A call that rings once and disappears. That isn't a dead battery. It isn't normal. It's someone turning the phone on long enough to see who's calling and turning it off again. And the thought settled into me like cold water. She saw my name. She chose to silence it. Or someone else did. I stepped back into the house slowly, the door clicking shut behind me like a final period. The air inside felt different now, less quiet, more aware. I placed the phone on the table beside her note. Her two small objects both refusing to speak. The indentation on the paper caught the light again. A sharp, narrow shadow inside the word she pressed too hard. I ran my thumb across it one more time, feeling the weight she left there. A weight I should have understood sooner. Her phone was still out there, silent, close enough to ring once, far enough to keep its secrets. And standing in the doorway, I let the question settle in the hollow of the room. If she didn't drive away, where did she go? Adrian showed up just as the morning light stretched across the hallway, thin, pale, almost reluctant to touch anything. I heard the knock, soft but steady, the kind that didn't ask permission so much as announce a presence. By the time I reached the door, he was already leaning against the porch rail, hands in his pockets, looking like he'd been standing there longer than he wanted me to believe. There was something about the way he straightened when he saw me, as if he'd come prepared for a moment I didn't know I was about to step into. He walked in without waiting for me to move aside, brushing past with a quiet, familiar confidence. Normally, that would have made me smile. He'd always treated my house like an extension of his own. But today, something in me stiffened. The air inside still carried the faint smell of Mara's candle, the one she'd left her note on. I hadn't lit it again, couldn't. It sat on the counter, untouched, like it was holding its breath. Adrian glanced around as if inventorying the space. Not nosy, not obvious, just attentive. I told myself it was normal. He was my older brother. He worried. But the way his eyes moved, slow, deliberate, pausing on corners where nothing had changed, it made the back of my neck warm. We hadn't talked much these last few weeks. I'd told him things were fine, the way people do when they're trying to convince themselves first. And he never pushed. Adrian never pushed. So seeing him here at 8 in the morning on a weekday wearing that soft, unreadable half-smile, it felt like he'd arrived knowing something I didn't, or something I hadn't admitted out loud yet. The house creaked under his footsteps, and for the first time I wondered if he'd come because he heard the silence before I did. He stopped near the kitchen island, resting his hand on the back of a chair like he was grounding himself. "Rough morning?" he asked too casually, eyes flicking toward the candle. I didn't answer right away. It wasn't that the question was strange. Anyon could see the house felt wrong. It was the speed of it, the precision, like he was cutting straight to the bone on purpose. I poured him coffee out of habit. He didn't drink it. Instead, he leaned his elbows on the countertop and exhaled through his nose, quiet but sharp. Then, without looking up, he asked, "Did she leave a note?" The words slid out smoothly, too smoothly. Not curious. I expected. I felt something in my chest dip like missing a step on the stairs. I set the mug down a little harder than I meant to. "How'd you know there was a note?" I tried to say it lightly, but the hallway seemed to narrow as soon as the sentence left my mouth. Adrian didn't flinch, didn't stutter. He just blinked once, slow, and said, "I didn't. I'm asking." But the pause before his answer, the tiny beat where his jaw tightened, told a different story. Kek. I hesitated before nodding, because admitting it felt like handing him a key I didn't understand. He gave the smallest exhale. Not relief, not shock, something quieter, and suddenly I knew. He'd been waiting to hear those words. He picked up the candle, turning it just enough to read the note still taped to the side. His eyes didn't widen, he didn't ask what it meant. He just studied it like he was memorizing something he'd already seen once before. Strange spot to leave something like this, he murmured. I watched the way his fingers hovered near the paper. Not touching, just close, too close. Like he was measuring the distance. I swallowed. Adrian, what's going on? At first he didn't respond. The morning light caught the side of his face, softening the lines I hadn't realized were there. When he finally looked up, his expression was so calm it unnerved me. I'm just trying to understand, he said. But it wasn't true. His voice was steady, even rehearsed. And rehearsed words don't tremble at the edges the way his did. A canet. I realized then that he wasn't reacting to the note. He was waiting for my reaction to it. You can't, as if my version mattered more than the note itself. Have you talked to her recently? I asked. He shrugged. Too quick. Not really a lie, not a loud one. Just soft enough to slip past someone who wasn't paying attention. But I was paying attention now. Every shift in his posture, every blink, every breath. How long had he been expecting this conversation? And why did it feel like he'd come prepared for an outcome I didn't yet see? Adrian set the candle back exactly where it had been, aligning the glass with the faint ring on the counter. A small, precise gesture, too careful. Then he stepped back and slipped his hands into his pockets, watching me the way someone watches a door they expect to open. The silence stretched long between us, soft but heavy. Finally, he said, if you find anything else, you'll tell me, right? Not a question, a direction disguised as concern. I nodded, though I wasn't sure why, or whether he believed me. As he moved toward the door, the sunlight caught his shadow on the floor, long, stretched thin, almost uncertain. I watched him leave without looking back, and for the first time since Mara disappeared, I felt a new kind of fear settle in the house, Maybe the note wasn't the only thing she left behind. The flame wasn't lit anymore, but the candle still cast a kind of shadow across the counter. Thin, gray, almost imagined. I found myself staring at it the same way I had last night, like the wax held the echo of her last breath in this house. Adrian stood beside me quiet, the note held between his fingers. He wasn't reading it. Not really. His eyes drifted, unfocused, as though his mind had already stepped into another room. Sometimes silence tells you more than the words ever will, and in that still kitchen, with morning light bending around us, I realized my brother was thinking about something he didn't want to say out loud. He finally set the note down, smoothing its edge with his thumb like he was trying not to leave a trace. King's stress, he murmured. People say odd things when they're overwhelmed. You know how it gets. Your cats. His voice was low, almost gentle, but not warm, Morse, like someone rehearsing a line they hoped would sound natural. I watched him as he stepped back, as if giving the paper space to breathe. But his eyes didn't follow the words. They stayed fixed on the candle, the glass smudged from her hands, the wick trimmed too neatly, the faint ring of dust around the base from where it hadn't been moved in weeks. Mara used to call it her reset ritual. She'd wait until the house was quiet, then light it and sit in front of it for 10 minutes, sometimes 20 shoulders slowly dropping as the day melted off her. She didn't like people watching her do it, said it made her feel seen in the wrong way. I wondered what had made her use it this time. What weight she'd been carrying that I hadn't noticed or hadn't asked about properly. Adrian cleared his throat. And maybe she just needed space, he said. Maybe she didn't mean for it to sound so final. But he didn't sound like someone guessing. He sounded like someone trying to guide me somewhere specific. When he suggested searching the house together, he didn't look at me. He was already turning toward the hallway, rubbing the back of his neck like he'd been waiting for the chance to move. Start fresh, he said. Check every room. It might help you feel grounded. Grounded, that was a word Mara used. Not Adrian. I followed him anyway because doing nothing felt worse. His footsteps were soft, too soft, considering he knew the creaks in my floors by heart. He avoided certain boards, gliding around them with the ease of someone who'd already mapped the path. We checked the living room first. He moved his hand along the top of the bookshelf, glanced behind the curtains, opened the cabinet near the TV. Every motion was measured, like he was searching for dust patterns instead of clues. He didn't open the drawer she kept her journals in, just looked at it, nodded once, and stepped away. And I tried opening my mouth to ask why that mattered, but the words didn't come. Something in his posture made my throat tighten. After a while, he exhaled and said, "Nothing here. Let's try the other side of the house." But it wasn't the words that caught me. It was the way his eyes flicked, just briefly, toward the narrow hallway Mara rarely used. The one that led to the storage room she kept locked, even from herself some days. We moved toward it slowly, the same way people approach a room where something fragile might be waiting. That hallway always felt colder than the rest of the house. Mara used to laugh and say the sun forgot about it, but today the air felt heavier, like someone had walked through it recently and disturbed the stillness. Adrian paused at the entrance. Did she ever mention using this space again? His tone was light, but his shoulders were stiff. No, I said. She avoided it. He nodded once, exactly once, like it confirmed something he already knew. When I reached for the door, he stepped back, barely, but enough to make the hairs on my arm rise. He didn't want to be the one touching it. Or maybe he didn't want me to see how he'd react if he did. Inside, the room smelled like old cardboard and dust. Nothing had changed. Her boxes were stacked the same way she'd left them months ago. The folded quilt her aunt made sat untouched on the top shelf. She never came in here, I whispered. Adrian scanned the room with a quick, practiced sweep. His eyes didn't linger long enough to truly look. As if he already knew what wasn't there, he turned to me. We should keep going, he said. No point staying in places she didn't use, but the hallway kept pulling his gaze, a quiet magnetism, a memory he wasn't naming. And that was when I felt it fully. He wasn't searching for where Mara had been. He was searching for where she hadn't. We returned to the kitchen in silence. The morning light had softened into a deeper gold, warming the counter where the candle sat like a quiet witness. Adrian stopped beside it again, staring not at the note, but at the faint shadow the glass left on the surface, as if that shadow was the only honest thing in the room. "You'll call me if anything changes," he said softly. I nodded, though his voice made it feel less like a request and more like a condition. He lingered a moment longer, thumb brushing the edge of the countertop. Then he turned and walked down the hallway toward the door, his steps slowing only when he passed the very hallway he'd been watching earlier. He didn't look inside, he didn't need to, and as the door clicked shut behind him, I realized the candle wasn't the only thing casting a shadow in my house now. The house felt different after Adrian left, quieter but not in a peaceful way. More like the air had tightened, listening for something I still didn't know. Uika. I stood alone in the kitchen, the candle's cooled wax holding the shape of last night's flame. The note sat beside it, folded once, the crease uneven, like it had been handled too many times in too little light. I told myself I'd already read it enough. But the moment I picked it up again, something inside me shifted, a faint tug behind the ribs. There are times when paper feels heavier than truth should ever weigh. Kelly. I moved toward the dining table because the morning sun had finally found its way across the floor, pooling into a soft rectangle of pale gold. It felt like the right place to see things clearly, or maybe I just needed the excuse. The wood surface was warm under my palms. Dust caught the light in thin, slow-moving lines. Outside, a car passed distantly, its sound drifting in and fading as if it didn't want to interrupt. I unfolded the note again. Deliberate, slow, Mara's handwriting always carried this strange elegance, loopy, gentle curves, the kind of penmanship teachers used to hold up as an example. And even now, even in this moment, her loops looked soft, but the words didn't feel soft, they felt final. Still, my eyes kept going back to the faint ridge halfway down the page, the small dent I'd noticed earlier but hadn't allowed myself to examine. The kind of mark a hand makes when it hesitates, or when it presses down harder than intended. I brought the note closer, then angled it toward the sun, and slowly the surface revealed its hidden textures, little shadows forming inside the grooves of the paper. Something had been written there, then erased, or overwritten. I wasn't sure which was worse. I held my breath as I traced the indentation with my fingertip. The paper was smooth except for that one section where the pen had bitten down a little deeper. Not enough to leave ink, but enough to leave memory. At first it looked like nothing, just a ripple in the fibers. But when I tilted the page again, a shape emerged, a curve, then a single slanted line, letters, maybe Candapard, or part of a word. My pulse quickened in my throat, too loud, too present. Mara never rushed when she wrote. If she had changed her mind, if she had crossed something out, it meant the first thing mattered enough to reconsider. I leaned closer. My chair creaked. The refrigerator hummed behind me like a faint reminder of normalcy. Ken, I whispered to the empty room. What were you trying to say? The grooves formed the beginning of a longer sentence, longer than the short goodbye she'd left visible. This was something else, something she hadn't wanted me to read, or maybe something she wanted me to read but couldn't bring herself to leave behind. My fingers trembled slightly as I tried to follow the faint tracks. But they blurred together halfway in, as if she'd pressed harder and then lifted too quickly. The meaning dissolved in the paper's texture, and I couldn't shake the feeling she'd tried to tell me something and then swallowed it whole. I stood up, needing movement, needing air. The note remained on the table, catching the light in a way that made the erased words seem almost alive. Some part of me wondered whether Mara had written the longer sentence first or last. Had she started to explain something, then changed her mind, recant? Or had she written the goodbye, stared at it, and added something she couldn't bear to leave behind? My throat tightened as I imagined her sitting right where I stood now, elbows on the table, hair falling forward. Candle flickering across her face while she leaned over the page. Did her hand shake? Did she pause? Did she whisper something to herself before deciding the words didn't belong? I didn't know, but I could almost feel the moment she pressed down harder, the indentation deeper than the rest. That was the part that scared me, the pressure, the urgency. It meant emotion. It meant something real enough to leave a mark even without ink. I tried again to read the grooves, leaning close until my breath fogged the surface, a word almost formed. Maybe starting with a TT, or maybe that was just the way the paper bent. Nothing made sense, and yet all of it felt intentional. Finally, I lifted the note to eye level. In the quiet house, it felt like holding a missing piece I wasn't meant to find. What did she want to tell me, and why had she taken it back? The sunlight shifted slowly as clouds drifted over the house, dimming the room so the shadows on the paper softened into almost nothing. I set the note down carefully like it might bruise if handled too roughly. A faint breeze slipped in through the open kitchen window. It moved the edges of the note just enough that it tapped against the wood, a tiny sound, fragile and rhythmic. I watched it for a long moment. Something in that unfinished indentation held more weight than the words Mara left me. A message trapped between intention and fear, between what she wanted me to know and what she was afraid I'd learn. When the breeze finally stilled, the note lay quiet again, as if it had settled into a decision, but I hadn't. And as I stepped back from the table, one thought settled into my chest like cold water. What truth was she trying to write? Before she decided I wasn't ready to read it, the hallway was still the way she left it, too narrow, too quiet, and spoiled. A thin ribbon of morning light slipped beneath the bathroom door and stretched across the floorboards like it was trying to escape. I stood in the middle of it, holding my breath, listening to the house breathe around me. Funny thing is, you can tell when a place wants to hide something. There's a kind of heaviness to the air, like someone whispered a secret, and the walls are still holding it. That was the feeling I had when I touched the drawer she never opened. The hallway smelled faintly of cedar and that old lavender polish Mara used to use on the mirror frames. I hadn't noticed it in months, maybe years. Funny how scent waits for you like grief with patience. I'd come back for simple things I told myself I'd forgotten. A scarf, a charger, a photograph. But the truth is I wasn't looking for objects. I was looking for pieces of her, little hints of the woman she used to be before silence filled our rooms. I walked slowly, brushing my fingertips along the walls, her walls. The paint was smooth in some places, chipped in others. She always said she'd repaint in the spring. Spring never came for us. The drawer sat beneath the small hallway table, tucked between two uneven legs that wobbled if you breathed too close. She'd walk past it every morning without looking down, almost like she didn't trust it. I used to ask her what she kept in there. She'd just smile, one of those quiet, faraway smiles, and say nothing worth opening. But grief changes the weight of curiosity. And standing there, with dust floating through the light like tiny ghosts, nothing worth opening suddenly sounded like a dare. So I pulled the handle, expecting emptiness, finding something else entirely. The drawer slid open with a soft sigh, like it had been waiting for the chance. Inside, everything was too neat, too deliberate. Mara wasn't tidy. She was orderly in the way a storm is orderly, meaning only she understood it. But this was different. A stack of envelopes sat in the center, perfectly aligned, edges crisp despite the years. A thin ribbon, faded blue, frayed at the tips, held them together. I touched the top envelope, tracing her handwriting. I knew that curve of her M, the way she pressed too hard on downstrokes, but there was no address. Just blank space where a name should have lived. The dates were what caught me next. Months I barely remembered. Months she'd moved through quietly, almost like she was walking underwater. That was around the time she stopped humming in the mornings, stopped sitting by the window, stopped looking me in the eye for longer than a heartbeat. The house around me went still. Cack. Even the old refrigerator down the hall paused its humming as if listening. Then footsteps, soft at first, then closer. And when I turned, Adrian was standing behind me, so close I could feel the warmth of his breath on my shoulder. "You shouldn't go through that," he said. I didn't jump, but my hands froze above the envelopes. There was something in his voice I hadn't heard before, a firmness, a warning wrapped in politeness. They're just old things," Adrian continued. He stepped closer, reaching for the drawer but stopping just short. "Mara didn't mean anything by them. Best to leave it as it is." His eyes darted to the envelopes like they were lit from within. I swallowed. "You knew about these?" He hesitated, the kind of hesitation that says more than any confession. "She mentioned them," he answered too quickly. "Told me they weren't important." I lifted the stack. The ribbon was lighter than I expected, like it had been tied by trembling hands. Adrian's breath caught. I heard it, even though he tried to hide it. "Don't," he said softly, but it wasn't softness. It was control wearing quiet clothes. I looked at him, really looked at him, and something inside me shifted. The hallway felt smaller, his presence felt larger, and Mara's absence, it felt suddenly louder. "Why don't you want me to read them?" I asked. He didn't answer right away, his jaw tensed. "Kakin." A muscle twitched near his eye. "They're private," he finally said, "and they won't help you some things. They weren't meant for you to carry." I held the letters against my chest. For the first time since Mara left, I felt cold. Adrian took a slow step back, like he realized he'd come too close to something fragile, or something dangerous. The floor creaked between us, remembering our weight. I closed the drawer with my foot, the sound echoing down the narrow hallway. The envelopes felt heavy now, heavier than the ribbon suggested. He watched me walk past him, silent, but his silence wasn't empty. It had edges, sharp ones. Outside, the afternoon light had shifted. The sky looked bruised, like it knew something I didn't. I didn't open the letters, not yet. But as I stepped onto the porch, I knew one thing with startling clarity. Whatever Mara wrote in those months, we lost. Adrian didn't want the truth coming back, and that meant it was already on its way. The house changed as the sun sank. Shadows lengthened across the floors, pooling in corners I thought I knew. Even the familiar rooms felt foreign, heavier somehow, like they were holding a memory they weren't ready to share. I stood by the living room window, watching the light fade in slow, soft swaths across the couch, the rug, the faint outline of Mara's favorite mug on the counter. Outside, a car passed. Its headlights traced across the walls, sharp and searching, like fingers running over the surface of everything I thought I understood. I could feel the air shift. I wasn't alone, or maybe I was too aware of absence. Either way, the house had secrets tonight, and it knew I was watching. Adrian's voice came from the hallway, hesitant but insistent. "You should come over tonight," he said. "Just for a few hours. We can sort through all this tomorrow." And his footsteps were soft but deliberate, each one pressing into the wood like he wanted me to follow. I didn't. I told him no, not because I didn't need him, not because I wasn't exhausted, but because the rooms Mara touched, the air she breathed, felt like the last anchor I had. I wandered from room to room, letting my fingers drift across surfaces she'd brushed. The kitchen counter, the edge of the dining table, the back of her chair. Every object carried a memory too small to explain, a gesture too brief to fully understand. I replayed our last interactions, tiny pauses, fleeting glances, words left unfinished. The way she leaned back slightly when I reached for her hand. The way her voice faltered when she said something ordinary, like "I'll see you later." I didn't understand then. And I didn't understand now, but the house did. The light outside softened, turning the living room walls the color of bruises. And I noticed something, a shadow stretching across the floor that didn't belong to me. I tried to focus on ordinary things, a mug, the newspaper on the counter, the soft hum of the refrigerator, but the sense of being watched clung to me like a second skin. Outside, the same car circled again, slower this time, and its headlights swept across the room, catching the rug, the couch, the faint imprint of Mara's slippers by the door. It paused just for a moment and then moved on. I held my breath. Adrian appeared behind me, leaning against the doorway. His presence was sudden enough to make my pulse hitch, but he didn't move closer. "See anything?" he asked, voice low, casual. I shook my head, forcing a calm I didn't feel. He studied me for a moment, his eyes catching the last glow of dusk. Sometimes it helps to not be alone, he said, softer this time. I wanted to tell him I wasn't alone. Okay, I was surrounded by her absence. Every shadow held a question, every whisper of air felt like her hesitation. He didn't push, not yet, but his gaze lingered, heavy with expectation, and I realized he knew I wouldn't leave, not while her presence still lingered, quiet and insistent in every corner of this house. Alone again, I moved back to the living room window. And the evening light had nearly vanished, leaving the room washed in soft, gray darkness. I could hear the house settling around me, the floorboards sighing, the air moving in a slow, deliberate rhythm. I thought about Mara. Nekis. Every small distance she created between us in the last days, replayed like a film, pauses that stretched too long, smiles that didn't quite reach her eyes, gestures that seemed calculated for someone else. Why had she done that? Why had I ignored it? Or pretended not to notice? A car passed again, this time turning the corner slowly. Its headlights swept over the living room, brushing against the edge of the couch. Wehindran Bath tine fast and Farron Bean, glancing at the table, then moving on. It was just a car, it was just light, but my chest tightened. I felt watched, not from outside, but from the spaces she had left behind, from the echoes she had made in the air, in the shadows, in the very walls. I realized that her absence had left a presence of its own, a presence that questioned me, examined me, waited. The night was thick with it, and I didn't know if I wanted to find the answer, or just sit in the space she had left. I sank into the couch, letting my hands rest on the cushions she'd touched. The darkness thickened around me, soft but tangible, pressing in on every side. The house creaked like it remembered her footsteps. The air smelled faintly of candle wax and lavender. Outside, the occasional car passed, light flickering across the walls, brief and searching. I didn't move, I didn't look outside, and I just sat letting the quiet press in. And in that silence, one thought settled in my chest, cold and insistent. I was not alone. But the one who had been here last, the one who left everything I couldn't see, might already be watching, waiting. The night carried questions Mara had left unanswered, and somehow I knew I had to stay to hear them. I sat on the edge of the couch, the stack of letters in my lap, heavier than the silence around me. The house seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for me to make a choice I'd already known I would. Akane. The ribbon was frayed between my fingers, the paper soft and warm, carrying hybrid fingers, the paper soft and warm, carrying her scent faintly, candle wax, lavender, a trace of her perfume I thought I'd imagined. I hesitated, longer than I wanted to, long enough to hear the floorboards creak behind me, though I knew I was alone. Finally, I untied the ribbon and lifted the top envelope. The faint scratch of the paper opening felt louder than any shout. Inside, Mara's handwriting curved across the page like a whispered confession, and I knew, the moment I read it, nothing would feel the same again. I traced the first line with my finger before reading. "Someone has been checking on me," it said. The words were simple, but they carried a weight that pressed into my chest. Her loops were neat, controlled, almost like she was trying to convince herself she was safe while writing. But the sentences twisted in ways that suggested she wasn't. I read on. Her words mentioned Adrian more than once. A presence I'd never considered suspicious, framed instead as careful, protective. And yet each mention left me with a hollow ache, a coil of confusion twisting tighter around my ribs. I tried to picture her writing it, the way her hand trembled, the way she paused mid-sentence, the way she must have swallowed a word she'd wanted to leave behind. A tear smudged the corner of the letter. Not mine, her own. I felt a strange, bitter betrayal. Not just because of what she'd written, but because she'd written it at all. Because the trust I thought was ours seemed to have slipped invisibly into someone else's hands. The house pressed around me, familiar yet unknowable, and I realized the quiet carried judgment. Or maybe it was just my own. She described the feeling of being followed, of someone hovering where she never asked them to be. A presence she couldn't see but could sense in the subtle brush of air, the light shifting across her walls, the faint echo of footsteps in empty rooms. And then the words that tore through me, mentions of Adrian, more than once, framed as someone she thought would protect her, someone she believed would watch without judgment, without expectation. My hand shook slightly as I held the letter. The paper was fragile, the edges worn from what I imagined were repeated readings, or nervous handling. It. I remembered the way Adrian had hovered earlier, insisting I leave the letters alone, guarding them like treasure or evidence. And the realization slithered through me slowly. She had trusted him. or feared him. I wasn't sure which. Each sentence wound tighter, curling around my chest, filling me with questions I couldn't answer. Did she feel safe with him because of what I had done or not done? Did she hide from me while hoping he would understand? I stared at the final line of the letter. And the ink was smudged, blurred, as though a tear had wiped the words away before she could decide whether to leave them. I pressed my thumb lightly over the smear, tracing it, feeling its residue. The words were gone, but the weight remained. I sank back into the couch, letter pressed to my chest, and let the quiet fill me. The house groaned around me, floorboards flexing under the weight of unseen memories. Why Adrian? Why not me? I thought of every glance she had spared me in recent months, every small pause in conversation, every half-finished sentence, the subtle distances I had ignored, the quiet moments I had dismissed. And now here it was, laid bare on paper yet still incomplete, a confession she didn't dare finish. I felt anger and confusion coil together in my chest, not at Mara but at the impossibility of understanding her choices, at the way trust could bend in shadows, shifting silently from one person to another. The smudged line burned in my memory like a question that couldn't be answered. What had she tried to say? And why hadn't she said it to me? I wanted to call Adrian, I wanted to demand an explanation. But something in me paused, because if I opened that door, I might discover truths I wasn't ready to bear. The letter, fragile and soft in my hands, felt like the hinge of the entire house. And I realized with a hollow certainty that the moment I closed it, nothing would ever be the same. I laid the letter on the coffee table, letting the dim light of dusk fall over it. Its edges caught the faint glow, highlighting the curves of her handwriting and the faint smudge at the bottom. Outside, a car passed slowly, headlights brushing across the room like fingers searching for something lost. I leaned back, letting the silence settle. The house held its breath, and so did I. I didn't want to move. I didn't want to speak. But one thought pressed against my mind, heavy and insistent. Mara had someone else with her fear, and whatever reason she had, it was now mine to uncover. The night deepened, and I knew the questions would not wait, not for me, not for anyone. And somehow I feared what the answers might cost me. Good morning came slowly, spilling through the kitchen window in pale, hesitant streaks. The candle Mara had lit months ago caught the light, casting long, distorted shadows across the table. Shadows that seemed to tremble with the weight of secrets. And I set the stack of letters beside it, their edges crisp, the ribbon loose and frayed. Each envelope felt heavier than it should, as if the paper carried the burden of everything Mara had left unsaid. Adrian appeared in the doorway, calm as ever, but today the calm felt like a mask stretched too thin. I gestured to the letters. Explain this, I said softly, and for the first time I saw the hesitation behind his eyes. The kitchen smelled faintly of coffee and stale morning air. I hadn't made a cup yet. My job, I couldn't. Everything here, the table, the candle, the faint outline of her mug, was saturated with her presence. And I needed Adrian to break it. I watched him lean against the counter, hands folded, posture casual but rigid. The sunlight painted his face in stripes, and the shadows cut across his expression like lines of accusation. I laid the letters flat, one by one, and let the ribbon fall loose. I didn't touch them again. I didn't have to. They were a silent testament. I know you knew, I said, voice steady but quiet, and I need the truth right now. The kitchen held its breath. Even the refrigerator hum seemed to pause. I felt the weight of every unspoken word between Mara and Adrian pressed down on my shoulders. He exhaled, slowly, almost like the words were lodged in his throat. I did, he admitted. I knew she was planning to leave. The silence that followed was thicker than any accusation I could have spoken. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. Hang. The letters shifted slightly, ribbons sliding across the wood, catching faint glimmers of sunlight. Why didn't you tell me? I asked, each word deliberate, measured. Why keep it from me, from your own brother? Adrian's hands twitched at his sides. I wanted to protect you, he said. His voice sounded rehearsed, like he had said it to himself many times before saying it to me. Some things are too heavy to bear without context. I glanced down at the top letter, tracing the faint smudge where her tears had blurred the ink. She trusted you, I said quietly, more than me. Or maybe she feared you. I don't know which. But why? Adrian's eyes flicked to the candle, then back to me. There are reasons, he said, careful. Flow slow. Anne, I thought I was helping her, helping you both. I shook my head, a hollow weight settling in my chest. Helping? By lying to me? By keeping her words hidden? The sunlight shifted, elongating the shadows of the letters. Each one seemed to stretch toward me, pleading for understanding I couldn't yet give. Ken. I stood abruptly, the chair scraping softly against the floor. I need to know, I said, voice firmer now. What did she tell you that she couldn't tell me? Adrian's jaw tightened, and he looked at the candle, at the letters, and finally back at me. She asked me to listen, he admitted, to be the one who understood. I felt my stomach tighten. The coil of betrayal and confusion I had carried since Mara left constricted further. Why? I whispered. Kamenavan techer sevenat sa, at am her septet percentant at 17 show. Why her words go to you and not to me? I am her husband. I am the one she married. Why? Adrian swallowed. I don't know, he said. Some things she couldn't, some things she wanted to protect you from. And maybe she didn't trust herself to explain. The room fell silent again. The sunlight tilted slightly, catching the edges of the letters like they were small windows into a life I could no longer touch. And for the first time, I realized that Adrian wasn't simply withholding information. He was holding it in limbo, balancing between loyalty to Mara and loyalty to me, leaving me suspended in questions I had no right to answer yet. I sank back into my chair, hands gripping the table. Everything felt heavier, everything felt incomplete. Adrian stepped back, finally letting the space between us breathe. The sunlight faded slightly, and the candle's shadow stretched long across the table, pointing toward the stack of letters like a silent accusation. I stared at them. The smudged ink, the neat handwriting, the thin ribbon binding months of her thoughts, all of it seemed alive, vibrating with questions I couldn't yet answer. Was she protecting me or protecting herself? I murmured. Adrian said nothing. The room was quiet, but the weight of the truth pressed in from every corner, and though he had admitted to knowing, I knew the real story was still hidden somewhere between his silence and her words. I ran a finger along the top envelope, feeling the faint imprint of her writing. The truth was here in my hands, but uncovering it would cost more than I was ready to pay. And yet, I couldn't look away. The house was quiet, softer than I remembered it ever being. Outside, the world had not yet stirred. The sky was a deep, bruised blue, just a hint of light at the horizon. Runka. I sat at the kitchen table, pencil in hand, the stack of letters pressed beneath my palm. The candle flickered gently, throwing wavering shadows across the walls, across the note Mara had left. I traced over the faint indentations, pressing carefully, slowly, painfully. A line of words emerged from the paper, delicate as frost. Your brother was here again. The letters felt heavier than ever, not just words but proof. Proof of the urgency she had never voiced, the fear she had swallowed, the warning she hadn't finished. I leaned back, letting the silence press in. Everything clicked, and yet nothing felt resolved. Kai. I stared at the words, pencil still trembling in my hand. The indentations, faint at first, became sharper under the graphite's pressure. I could almost feel the weight of her hesitation, the careful pause before she stopped herself. The kitchen smelled faintly of wax and old coffee. The floorboards creaked softly beneath me, each sound echoing like a heartbeat in the empty house. I thought of Adrian, his calm demeanor, the way he had hovered in the background all along. The realization gnawed at me. She hadn't been leaving a farewell for me. She had been leaving a warning. Her fear, her urgency, it had been right there all along, hidden in the spaces between her words. The note's brevity was deliberate. There was no time for long explanations. I pressed the pencil harder, following the faint grooves. The line of the sentence was delicate, trembling beneath my fingers. Your brother was here again. I repeated it quietly, over and over, letting the cadence sink into my chest. It wasn't a goodbye. It wasn't a simple letter. It was a lifeline she had thrown into the dark, hoping someone would understand before it was too late. Memories I had brushed off came rushing back, each one sharper, clearer. Her pauses at the table, the subtle glances toward the hallway, the small, tense smiles she gave Adrian. Now the pieces fit together like fragments of a broken mirror. The urgency in her letters, the unspoken distance in our conversations. The way she had pressed the pencil harder on certain words, almost leaving them etched in the page as if insisting I notice. I thought of Adrian's insistence that the letters stay unread, that some things be left alone, and suddenly I understood. He hadn't been hiding them from me out of malice. He had been hiding them because the warning was meant for me, but incomplete. I held the pencil lightly, trembling, staring at the sentence that had never been spoken aloud. Your brother was here again. The realization coiled in my chest. Everything made sense. The tension, the fear, the note itself. It wasn't about leaving me. It was about keeping me safe. The candle flickered, and I imagined Mara there, pale in the candlelight, urgency in her eyes. Okay. She had written what she could, then stopped. Something or someone had stopped her from finishing. And I knew without words the question I had to answer: where had she gone before Adrian could intervene? I pressed the pencil again, following each groove like a path through the fog. Kat, her handwriting, delicate and controlled, revealed the fear she had never spoken. Every letter, every curve was a whisper of panic I could feel in my chest. I pictured her hurried movements, the subtle glances over her shoulder, the way she must have gripped the doorknob before leaving. And then the weight of Adrian's presence hit me, the calm, the protection, the silent watching. He had known all along, and yet she had slipped away. Why didn't I see it? Haltzi, and I murmured to the empty kitchen. The words felt hollow. She hadn't left me a goodbye. She had left me a warning I had only just uncovered. I remembered the hallway, the rooms she rarely used. The drawer she hadn't opened, all the small details I had ignored, now ringing with significance. My hands shook as I realized the truth. This note wasn't about her leaving me. It was about something she feared would happen if Adrian found her first. She had planned something urgent, something I hadn't been part of. She had planned something urgent, something I hadn't been part of. I stared at the faint pencil lines, soft in the candlelight, and let the implications settle. Everything I had assumed about the morning, about her departure, about trust, it was all wrong, and yet the final question remained, echoing through the quiet house. Where had she gone? The candle flickered once, twice, and then steadied. Its light danced across the letters, illuminating the fragile sentence carved into the page. I held the note close, breathing in the faint scent of wax and her presence. Your brother was here again, I whispered, and the words lingered, heavy in the air, heavier in my chest. The house was still, the floorboards quiet, the dawn waiting to break. I felt the weight of her urgency, her fear, her unspoken plan pressing into me. I didn't know where she had gone. I didn't know how far ahead she had moved without me noticing. But I understood, finally, the gravity of what she had meant to say. The pencil rested on the table, silent. And in the soft glow of the candle, I realized that the next choice was mine to make. Her warning had been found. The rest of the story, where she had gone, why, and what would happen next, was still out there, waiting, and